Okay, good morning, everyone. Whether you're here with me now or whether you join later, we're going to get as far as we can with our discussion about endocrine systems today. But I don't want to hurry it too much because it's not that these are that difficult to understand. It's just that many of the things that we're going to talk about have many steps to them that we need to get clear in our minds. So especially when you are revising this, remember to go through each of these as if it was a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. Don't just try to kind of memorize the entire diagram, whatever in your head as it is. Understand each of the steps that we discuss. The other thing to remind you, please, that there is a quiz today, but that quiz is available to you all day from 10 o'clock on. I think I've set the time limit is 25. It's a short quiz. So that will be available to you all day. Also, don't forget that this is the Easter weekend. So there's a break all the way from Thursday until Monday. So, but I believe that Tuesday is actually a Monday in the college timetable. So I will see you again on Tuesday. All right, so here's where we ended up last time, I believe. We're talking about the general principles of feedback mechanisms. And although most of the systems that we're going to talk about are feedback systems, where a stimulus is lowered by the action of a sensor. There are a few systems which are actually feed forward. These are positive feedback loops, not negative feedback loops. And the classic one that we need to discuss is this, which is the system which leads the breast to actually produce milk, to release milk rather. There are two systems that operate, one which causes the breast to generate milk, and then another system, and this is what we're going to talk about now, which gets the breast to actually release the milk, to actually pump it. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong diagram. Where are we? Sorry. There we are. Sorry. So this whole system works so that when an infant is suckling, the breast produces more and more and more milk. So first of all, this is our introduction to the complexity of the functioning of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives information in many forms. It receives information from sensory neurons all over the body, but it also is a direct sensor itself. In this case, however, it is receiving information from the breast, and it's largely the sensation of the infant suckling, but there is also, believe it or not, a very strong psychological component which appears to feed to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, we discuss it's the details of its functioning in a minute, but it communicates with the pituitary gland. And so the sensor is actually the hypothalamus. It senses that suckling is taking place. And it talks to the pituitary. And the pituitary releases a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is extremely interesting hormone. It's also called the loving hormone, because it's a hormone which produces a feeling of affectionate well-being. When a mother gazes at her infant and she has that upwelling of affection, that's a genuine feeling, but it's also stimulated by the presence of oxytocin. So oxytocin is secreted, it enters the bloodstream, and it travels through the bloodstream to the breast, and it causes the smooth muscles in the breast to pump milk. When milk is pumped, the baby will suckle harder. The baby will successfully suckle. That successful suckling provides a stimulus, and the stimulus is picked up by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus then gets the pituitary to produce more oxytocin. And this is a feed-forward system. It's a positive feedback. The more the infant suckles, the more milk is produced. That's the classic outcome. Okay, so be able to contrast feedback systems with the negative feedback and a feed-forward with a positive feedback. Okay, now in the systems, the feedback systems, the classic one which you really do need to understand, we have already discussed. We've already discussed it in some detail in actual fact, and I'm not going to repeat it. And this is the system which maintains blood glucose. It operates through two competing systems, both of them regulated by the pancreas. The pancreas is able to release two kinds of hormone. The one hormone is insulin, which will lower blood sugar. The other one is glucagon, which will raise blood sugar. And those two systems compete with one another the whole time to maintain an optimum blood glucose level. So I'm not going to go over that in detail. There is a slide right here. Please revise that and make sure that you understand all of the functioning, especially the functioning of alpha cells and beta cells in the pancreas. We're going to move on to discuss the functioning of the hypothalamus and the pituitary in some detail. So first of all, let me show you exactly where the hypothalamus is, what it looks like. The hypothalamus is actually part of the brain. It is largely made up of neural tissues. And its location is right here. Sorry, right here. Can you see this sort of cavity there? That is actually one of the cerebral ventricles. And the hypothalamus is formed from the walls of that ventricle down here at the end here. So have a look here and you'll see what I mean. This inside here is cavity, which is the cerebral ventricle, and its walls form this funnel-shaped organ here, which is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is extremely complex and is one of, I've told you before, it's often called the conductor of the body's orchestra because it is picking up information from all over the body, and it is coordinating the functioning of many of the endocrine glands. And the endocrine glands, their hormonal release is what controls the activity of the body's organs. So hypothalamic control is essential to the functioning of the whole organism. The hypothalamus largely operates, not entirely, but largely operates through talking to a gland which is associated with it, which is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland, in actual fact, is really two glands, two separate glandular systems which lie together. And here they are here. Very important to get in our minds, the anterior pituitary towards the front, and the posterior pituitary, the part of the pituitary towards the back. Here they are here, anterior and posterior, and you can see closely associated and actually attached to the hypothalamus. They're very small. It's an extraordinary thing that these very tiny glands actually wield such power over the whole organism. But we know that that power is very important because when something goes wrong, it can have very drastic effects. As we saw at the very start of this lecture series, the pituitary dwarfism and pituitary giantism have both resulted through errors in the system. Okay, so there it is there. Get that clear in your mind, because it's really, we need to make clear distinction between anterior pituitary and posterior because their functioning is quite different. And the communication with the hypothalamus is quite different as well. So the hypothalamus is able to receive sensory input from all over the body. Neurons actually communicate directly to the hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus also has sensory capability itself. So, for example, it can directly sense blood temperature, as well as receiving information about temperature from the rest of the body. It can sense blood pH, those sorts of things, and respond to true changes in blood pH. And the hypothalamus is then going to, when it receives that information, it will respond by getting the rest of the endocrine system to respond in some particular way. So here again, here's the hypothalamus, the walls of the ventricle there. Here's the pituitary. I just point out to you that these diagrams, that swap them around. Always, here's the anterior pituitary in this particular diagram. Here's the posterior here. We can tell there's the front of the brain. There's the back of the brain. You can always tell the back of the brain because that's where the cerebellum is there. Okay. So the way in which the hypothalamus interacts with the pituitary differs for anterior and posterior pituitary. And the hormones which result from that interaction are also different. So that's what I meant when I said that the pituitary is really like two glandular systems that are sandwiched together, even though it's anatomically called one thing. So let's have a look first at the posterior pituitary. Remember, this is the back of the brain here. Well, the posterior, most of the cells that are going to do this communication, they are nerve cells. They are nerve cells of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is actually a neural organ. So it's communicating with nerves. So for the posterior pituitary, have a look at the way in which the hypothalamic nerves are organized. Here's the cell body here in the hypothalamus, and the nerve axons run all the way down into the pituitary itself there. And in response to stimulus from the body, the hypothalamus will produce hormones which are produced by these nerve cells. So this is a neurosecretory system. And those secretions make their way all the way through the axons and are released here at the ends of the axons. They can be temporarily stored by the posterior pituitary, or else they make their way directly into the bloodstream. What's important to notice here is that this posterior pituitary is not producing any hormone itself. It's not functioning as an endocrine gland. It's rather like a railway junction. It's shunting the hormones from the hypothalamus into the bloodstream. And the two hormones which we need to remember for the posterior pituitary, both of these are produced by the nerve cells of the hypothalamus, by the hypothalamic cells themselves. These are ADH. You've heard about it before. That is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone. We heard about it when we talked about the kidney. And just think back for a minute. What did it actually do? What it did was it operated on the walls of the collecting duct of the kidney. And it allowed the walls of the collecting duct to become much more permeable to water, so that water passed out of the collecting duct into the kidney. It's a way of increasing the amount of water circulating in the body. It's a way of increasing blood pressure, for example. If you increase the volume of blood in the body, you increase the blood pressure. It's also released in response to thirst and things like this, so that we take up more water. So that is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Diuretic hormone would cause you to produce more urine, more dilute urine. Antidiuretic hormone causes you to produce more concentrated urine and conserve water. So it's operating on the kidney tubules. The other hormone released by the posterior pituitary, actually produced by the hypothalamus, but released from the posterior pituitary, is the one we've already talked about, oxytocin. And oxytocin has many effects in the body. We talked about its effect on the breast. That is a classic oxytocin effect, is to affect smooth muscle. The other place where it becomes really critically important is during labor. During labor is also a feed-forward positive feedback. It operates on the uterine muscles, and it causes the cramping of the uterine muscles, the contraction of the uterine muscles, which expel the fetus. So that it has other effects as well. And people are becoming increasingly interested in the effects, the psychological effects of oxytocin. I told you it's called the loving hormone for a good reason, and that is it increases in concentration, even in response to things like people stroking their pets or whatever. It's been actually measured to increase in the bloodstream in those sort of circumstances. Okay, so those are posterior. There's only two that you need to remember. When we get to the anterior pituitary, we're going to see that it becomes a little bit more complicated, because now the hypothalamus is actually going to talk to an endocrine function of the pituitary. And that chatter, the talking, is in two forms. The first is that very often the hypothalamus is going to release hormones, which are called releasing hormones, which cause the pituitary, for example, to then produce another hormone. But the hypothalamus can also release inhibiting hormones, which shut the systems down. So the hypothalamus is exerting positive and negative control. And the hypothalamus watches the systems really closely and manages them by hitting the accelerator, releasing hormones, or hitting the brake, inhibiting hormones. So we're going to see several of these systems, but just as a typical one, in response to hormonal changes in other hormonal changes in the body, the hypothalamus can release something like a prolactin releasing hormone. So prolactin releasing hormone doesn't have a global effect on the body. It only affects the cells of the pituitary. The prolactin releasing hormone goes to the pituitary, and it causes the anterior pituitary endocrine cells to release the hormone prolactin. Prolactin then goes into circulation in the body, and it causes the breast to manufacture milk. Remember, oxytocin causes its release, but prolactin means milk making, right? The prolactin causes the breast to actually manufacture milk. Oxytocin then affects the release of the milk. But prolactin is released in response to a prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So here we've just got a two-stage hormonal chain. The hormonal chains, these hormonal chains can become very complex. It is not necessarily just two steps. There may be several steps, as we'll see. And we then refer to it as a hormonal cascade. So let's have a look. Don't freak out at all of the names and everything here. But please do make an attempt, not just an attempt, please do make sure that you understand what these acronyms are for. Okay, there. If you get lost, there are plenty of descriptions in your text. So let's just have a look now at how the hypothalamus actually talks to the anterior pituitary, because it's different. Look at this, the anatomical structure. And you'll see here the axons of the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are short. And they actually terminate in the hypothalamus itself. They talk to the pituitary through blood vessels, through a network of blood vessels. That is actually a portal system. And I'll remind you, a portal system is a system where two organs communicate with one another without going through the heart. So in other words, this is a little circulatory system that runs between hypothalamus and the pituitary. So now the hypothalamus is going to release hormones. It's going to release releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones. And it's going to send those through the bloodstream. But now it's not sending them out to these are not being sent out to the body. They are being sent directly to the pituitary itself. And the anterior pituitary is extremely versatile. There are many different kinds of cells present in the anterior pituitary, many different endocrine cells, which can produce a wide variety of different pituitary hormones. And we're going to discuss this particular list. This is not, by the way, these are not the only ones. There are other hormones as well. All the way through, remember, the hypothalamus may be sending releasing hormones, accelerator. It may be sending inhibitory hormones, putting on the brake. And it is all the time. The hypothalamus is picking up information about what is happening in the body in response to the release of these hormones. So first of all, the anterior pituitary releases these this is FSH, that is follicle stimulating hormone. I'll do it slowly so that you can write these down. Follicle stimulating hormone. And LH, the luteinizing hormone, LUTEINIZING, luteinizing hormone. They usually operate together, and they are important hormones in both males and in females, largely involved with reproduction. In females, the FSH and LH interact to govern the formation of the follicle that the ovum is nurtured in the ovary, and ultimately the rupture of that follicle. Once in human beings, once a month or once every 28 days. So we're going later on, when we talk about human reproduction, we're going to hear about these in detail, about how they interact to produce the menstrual cycle. They also, however, operate in males. And in males, they govern the functioning of cells of the testes to produce sperm and to release testosterone. So in this case, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they are not only having, they can also not just have a physiological effect themselves, they can actually act on cells which are themselves endocrine cells. So they, for example, in the release of testosterone, they are partly involved in ensuring the levels of testosterone in the male. Okay, so the next one is thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a minute. But obviously, thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid and causes the release of another hormone called thyroxine, and thyroxine causes the metabolism to increase. So the next one is ACTH. This is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. It operates on the adrenal gland, but not on the whole adrenal gland. It operates on one part of the adrenal gland, which is the outside, the cortex of the adrenal gland. Please put this in your head, okay? Because we're going to discuss this again shortly. We're going to discuss how the hypothalamus interacts with the adrenal gland, because it's quite a complex story. The next one you've heard of already. We discussed it, and that is the prolactin. Is sometimes abbreviated PRL, prolactin. The next one we're not going to discuss in any detail is melanocyte stimulating hormone, and its functions are rather obscure. We're not going to discuss it. But the last one is one that you have heard about, and this is growth hormone, produced by the anterior pituitary. But growth hormone has effects on many, many different organ systems in the body throughout life. It's not only released, it is released in large amounts at puberty to cause that growth spurt that occurs in puberty, but it actually is released throughout our lives in a very controlled fashion, and it has important regulatory function for all growth and development, and also on cell division and all sorts of other things as well. So it affects many, many different organ systems. So I just want you to have a look at what is, there's a hidden subtle distinction in these hormones. That is, for example, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Well, where is the action directed? It's directed at ovaries and testis. And the ovaries and the testis are themselves endocrine glands. So these are hormones which are directed at an endocrine gland. What about thyroid? Thyroid is also an endocrine gland. So thyroid stimulating hormone is directed at an endocrine gland. So is ACTH. Prolactin, no. Prolactin operates directly on the tissues of the breast. Those are not endocrine tissues. Melanocyte stimulating hormone also, it's not, I'll just tell you, it's not directed at endocrine glands. Growth hormone is directed at endocrine glands, but also at the other tissues in the body. It operates both chattering to other endocrine glands, but also causing effects on muscle, directly causing effects on muscle, bone, liver, all sorts of things as well. So there's a distinction there. Are the hormones released here? Where are they directed? If they're directed at another endocrine gland, we call them tropic hormones. So tropic hormone is one released to have its effect on another endocrine gland. Non-tropic hormones are those which have their effect directly on tissues or globally through the body. So our tropic hormones are follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. The non-tropic ones are prolactin, which operates directly on the breast, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. We're not going to discuss its function, but just accept that it's a non-tropic. Growth hormone does both. It's both tropic and non-tropic. So if you hear me talking about tropic hormone or a tropic effect is a hormone which has its effect on another endocrine gland. So I'm not going to go through these tables. I just want to point them out to you. Please do go through these. And And first of all, it gives you a list of the hormones which are released by the different endocrine glands. Tells you the kind, whether they're peptide, protein, whatever. This is what you probably want to be most interested in, because this tells you in summary, the activity of the different hormones. So there's some work here for you to do. Although I will discuss examples of their activity later on. Okay, so let's have a look at a typical hormonal cascade. By no means the only one in the body, but it's a good example of a hormonal cascade. And this is the activity of the thyroid, one of the activities of the thyroid. The thyroid has several different activities. And it's a cascade because the activity of the thyroid is in response, ultimately, to a response by the hypothalamus to a change in homeostasis. The hypothalamus sees effectively a change in homeostasis, responds by producing and releasing hormone, which goes to the pituitary. The pituitary releases hormones, which are then going to cascade down, ultimately producing some effect, which is going to change the status of the homeostasis, typically by negative feedback. So let's just take a simple example. And this happens to us the whole time, that the environmental temperature changes. And if we become cold, well, cold itself, there are two ways our bodies perceive cold. The first is we actually have sensors in our skin and everything else, which tell us that it is cold. But the second thing is that actually our blood begins to cool, and the cooler blood begins to circulate. The hypothalamus can receive information from both sources. It can receive sensory information that the temperature has dropped, but it can also pick up the fact that the blood temperature is falling. And the hypothalamus is in response to falling blood temperature or to cold. It begins to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. That is TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. The thyrotropin releasing hormone percolates into that little portal system that runs between the pituitary and the hypothalamus. And it ends up affecting the cells of the pituitary. So this hormone, the releasing hormone, does not go into global circulation. Well, it may end up circulating, but it's not going to have any effect on cells in the rest of the body because they don't have receptors for it. The only cells which have receptors for it are in the anterior pituitary. And in response, the anterior pituitary now releases thyroid stimulating hormone. So it's releasing another hormone. And this is a tropic hormone, because this hormone is going to travel to the thyroid, and it's going to cause the thyroid, which is another endocrine gland, to release another set of hormones. So this thyroid stimulator hormone circulates throughout the body, but it has its effect on the tissues of the thyroid, and it causes the tissues of the thyroid to release two kinds of hormone. We're not going to worry, but just remember that it's actually, the thyroid is commonly referred to just as thyroid hormone, but there are different components to it. We won't worry about it. The effect of that thyroid hormone release is global. That thyroid hormone released into the body is extremely powerful, because what it does is it causes all of the cells of the body to increase their metabolism. They kick their cellular respiration, for example, into high gear. And as a result, remember that heat is a byproduct of metabolism, right? It's a waste product of metabolism. But we carefully manage our body temperature by regulating how much heat we generate and how much heat we release. And the generation of heat is regulated by thyroid hormone. So now the cells of the body begin to increase. They increase the temperature of the blood. That is in itself quite a dangerous thing, because we have very strict temperature limits. We can't raise the temperature too high. So we have to have a response to increasing body temperature as well. And the one response is simply to shut down this system. There are two places where a negative feedback operates. The first is in the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, in response to raising blood temperature, simply becomes less responsive to the releasing hormone. It just doesn't see it as well as it used to. So its activity begins to shut down. But the hypothalamus also responds. Remember, it's measuring blood temperature the whole time. And as the blood temperature begins to rise in response to increased cellular respiration, it stops secreting the releasing hormone. So as it stops releasing, it stops stimulating the pituitary. Pituitary stops stimulating the thyroid, and the temperature, that generation of high temperature stops. I will add that at the same time, we have cooling mechanisms, which are also controlled. And the thyroid is also involved there. The thyroid, for example, can get us to sweat more by releasing hormones. So in response to increased temperature, our hormonal systems also govern our cooling. So the two systems interact with one another to try to maintain an optimum body temperature. For the moment, just have this warming mechanism clear in your mind. There's one other thing that happens here. Here they've only talked about the thyroid hormone increasing metabolism. Thyroid hormones also get us to do one other thing when we're cold, which is a huge contributor to our warming up again, and that is shivering. Shivering is a response also to thyroid hormone. And what happens in shivering is it's another way of increasing metabolism, because it gets normally not very metabolically active tissue, which is the muscle, to start doing this, contracting and relaxing very rapidly, which is what produces the sensation of shivering, and that generates more body heat. So this is a very complex system, right? It's a cascade of hormones, and then the hormones have various effects. It's a typical endocrine cascade. Okay, I just put this slide up. I just want to put in a correction. This originally said a tropic hormone regulates function of endocrine cells or glands. That is true. It said that, though, that there were 3 primarily tropic hormones. Actually, that we've discussed 4. I just want to make sure that you have these clear in your mind. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. So that is sure to appear. Okay, so there's also the non-tropic interactions are also really important. And here we want to talk about the impact of one particular hormone, which is parathyroid hormone. Now, the parathyroids are small glands which lie together with the thyroid, but they quite different to the thyroid. Their functioning is quite different. And the parathyroid hormones are mainly involved with regulating the amount of calcium that is available to the body. Remember that the bones of the body are largely made up of a substance what stiffens bone is a substance called calcium phosphate. So calcium, we have this huge store of calcium in our body. Calcium ions, however, are essential. They're essential solutes for all sorts of things, especially for muscle function and for neural function as well. So regulation of the amount of calcium in circulation in the body is a critical function. And that homeostasis is maintained by two antagonistic systems. One from the parathyroid, which releases its own hormone called parathyroid hormone, and then another hormone released by the thyroid gland, and this is called calcitonin. And this is an important system, and I'm only going to discuss it in broad detail. But here is an opportunity for you to do some extra credit. If you send me, let's say, by this time next week, you send me 1 page explaining this system carefully, okay? In other words, being sure to include all the detail. I want an explanation of how parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, and vitamin D interact. Vitamin D is produced, strangely enough, by our skin in response to sunlight. And if you can actually suffer a vitamin D deficiency if you do not get sufficient sunlight. And you can supplement the vitamin D, certainly from food and things. But our principal mechanism for manufacturing vitamin D is to be exposed to the sun, and it has various effects in the body. But one of the things is it becomes involved in calcium regulation. The active vitamin D circulates in active form, but it is under influence of the kidneys. In fact, it becomes an active form. And one of the things that it does is vitamin D acts on the walls of the intestine, and it gets the walls of the intestine to absorb calcium, to increase its absorption of calcium ions from food. So the parathyroid hormones the parathyroid gland rather will respond to changes in calcium levels in the blood, and they will respond to lowered calcium levels by releasing parathyroid hormone, which acts on the kidneys, and the kidneys first of all begin to take up more calcium ion. They selectively take up more calcium ion in response to parathyroid hormone. In addition, parathyroid hormone causes the release of calcium from the bones. How it does that, I want to hear from you in your extra credit. Okay. For the moment, just accept parathyroid hormone causes the release of calcium from bones. You need to think, how does that happen? Well, look what is happening. First of all, we're releasing more calcium into the blood. We're getting the kidneys to take up more calcium from the fluids which are going to constitute the urine. The kidneys are stimulating the activity of vitamin D, which is going to increase the uptake of calcium from the intestine. All of these are going to cause blood calcium levels to rise. And I need to tell you something. High calcium levels in the blood can actually become toxic. There are conditions where calcium ion concentrations rise too high in the blood, and it's very dangerous. So it's essential to maintain homeostasis of the blood calcium. And blood calcium falls in response to activity of the thyroid. The thyroid gland actually releases a hormone called calcitonin. Here it is here. And calcitonin will cause more, for example, will cause more calcium to be put into the bones. It will shut down the production of calcium from the bones, and does various other things to lower the calcium levels. So those two systems compete, the thyroid and the parathyroid. Again, we've got hormonal systems competing, negative feedback in order to maintain an optimum homeostatic level. Okay, so leave that aside for the moment. Let's talk about the function of the adrenal glands. Now, normally at this point in the class, if I'm doing a live class, I do something like suddenly go, wow, to people, or I throw a book on the floor or something. I do something, in other words, to startle people in the class. And I then ask the class, what is happening to you? What has just happened, right? You get a fright. What has just happened? There's been a reflex response. And people's heart rate, for example, is going to increase, and their blood pressure is going to go up. This is a typical short-term fight or flight response. You don't analyze the situation at all, right? There's no psychological interpretation at all. There's a reflex response which throws you immediately into fight or flight. In other words, your whole body system is geared up to respond to threat. But it's a very short term. This does not last for very long. When you think about it, what happens in that short term is your heart, first of all, very importantly, your heart rate goes way up. There are all sorts of other things that are happening that you're not necessarily aware of. For a start, on a very short-term basis, the function of your gut ceases. You stop digesting. Peristalsis shuts down. The blood vessels in your gut actually contract to direct blood, to increase the blood pressure, for example, in the muscles, because you maybe need to run or you're going to fight. Whatever you're going to do, you're going to need good muscle activity. At the same time, all sorts of other things happen. Your pupils will dilate so that you pull in as much light and information as possible from the visual systems. All of these things are in response actually to hormones. And they're due to hormones released, you probably know, from the adrenal gland. But what you may not know is that in addition to the short-term fight or flight response, the adrenal gland is also responsible for managing long-term stress. That is stress which is continual, which is not necessarily provoking that instantaneous fight or flight, but which does need to have physiological response. And those two kinds of stress, that short-term and the long-term stress, are managed by entirely different parts of the adrenal gland. And again, the adrenal gland is rather like two glandular systems put together. And their functioning, although it's kind of related, their functioning is under different control systems. So here are the adrenal glands, here's the kidneys, and the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. They're not part of the kidneys, they just happen to be, they're just situated there. And the adrenal gland is divided into two anatomical portions. An outer part here, which is the adrenal cortex. Think back, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is where ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is going to have its activity. Its impact is going to be there. The other part is this part here, which is the medulla of the adrenal gland. And they're going to produce entirely different sorts of hormones, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so let's have a look at the function of the medulla. Now, it's the medulla of the adrenal gland, which is responsible for producing that fight or flight, the short-term response to a sudden threat. And again, it is under the control of the hypothalamus, but now the hypothalamus has an entirely different function. This is a reflex function, and under the sensory impact that the fright produces, the hypothalamus stimulates the adrenal medulla directly with a nerve impulse. A nerve impulse does pass through a reflex system in the spinal cord, but I mean through not a reflex system. This does pass through the spinal cord. This is a sympathetic nervous system function. So this is a totally unconscious function. The hypothalamus is communicating directly with the adrenal medulla through the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system in response to that sudden stimulus. And it gets the adrenal medulla to release these two hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is their proper name. Their common name is adrenaline and noradrenaline. And they are the hormones which operate globally to produce the fight or flight response. So this is a very, very quick system. Okay, it's almost like a reflex system because it produces an instantaneous response, but the response is due to the release of hormones from the adrenal glands. And this is these are all of the impacts of those hormones. The overarching thing that we need to remember is we need energy, and we need it quickly, and we need to direct that energy where it's really necessary, and that is to the muscles of the body. So everything that is not going to help fight or flee is going to be shut down. Everything that will help will be opened and operated. So the first thing we do is we break down glycogen in the liver to glucose. Glycogen is also stored in the muscles, by the way, and there it also gets broken down to glucose to feed the muscles lots of energy. We increase the blood pressure. We increase blood pressure to feed more blood to the muscles. But one of the ways in which we increase the blood pressure is to close off blood vessels, shut down blood vessels which feed unnecessary parts of the body, like the gut. We can shut down the gut temporarily. And in addition, by the way, you shut down gonads, the gonadal function and all sorts of things also shut down. Anything which is not necessary for fighting or fleeing, it gets shut down. We increase the metabolic rate, produce more energy. In order to feed all of this stuff, we have to increase the heart rate. We have to increase the respiration rate. We're going to need lots and lots of oxygen. But we increase alertness and everything. But think of all the things which are going to be shut down temporarily. I emphasize those because in actual fact, when we talk about the adrenal cortex function, we're going to produce some of these effects too, but on a long-term basis, on a longer-term basis, because this system here is just short-term. It's only going to work temporarily for minutes, not for hours and hours. Once the stress becomes long-term, even if it is at a lower level, once it becomes long-term, then this system no longer operates. Instead, we move to a system where the adrenal cortex becomes involved. And again, this is under control of the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary to produce adrenal corticotropic hormone. And the adrenal cortex is going to produce two kinds of hormone. They're going to produce one group called the glucocorticoids and another group called the mineralocorticoids. And I'll stop there because you will be wanting to get onto your quiz. And we'll complete this next time and move into our discussion about human reproduction. It segues neatly into that topic.